This week marks 4 years since the first ever All Elite Wrestling pay-per-view, Double or Nothing, with the 4th edition of the show set to take place this Sunday in Las Vegas, Nevada, the home of the first ever show. Since then, a lot has changed in the company, yet so much has stayed the same, with several of the promotion's originals making up the card this weekend, with the main event being filled with 3 stars that were in the 2019 pre-show Battle Royal, a pretty cool stat to consider 4 years later. So who leaves Las Vegas with the championships and the glory this time around? Well, let's not waste any more time and get into my predictions for AEW Double or Nothing 2023, and make sure you let me know yours in the comments down below. Let's start with a feud that's gotten pretty personal over recent weeks, with Adam Cole scheduled to battle Chris Jericho in an unsanctioned match, meaning anything goes, with Sabu being drafted in as the special enforcer. This one is a tricky one to call, especially when you consider that Cole recently cost Jericho a loss against Roderick Strong on AEW Dynamite last week, meaning if the Ocho was to get beat again, it would be a rare 2 losses in a row for him. With that said, it feels very much like AEW are building Adam Cole as a future challenger, or maybe even the next challenger for the World Championship, and for that to happen, he'll need to move on from this feud by getting one over on the man that has haunted him for the past number of weeks. Therefore, I'll go with a Cole victory for this one. TAYA Valkyrie will challenge AEW TBS champion Jade Cargill this week, this with the title on the line. This is in fact the second time this match has taken place in the past month, with Cargill of course retaining the first time of asking shortly after TAYA's AEW debut. Given that this is a rematch, this could lead you to think that 50-50 booking could come into play in order to protect Valkyrie as a credible title challenger going forward, although reports suggest that AEW have been holding off on Chris Statlander to return before having Jade drop the belt to her. It's a tough one to call, but for now I'll go with Jade Cargill for the win, as she looks to extend her reign that has now surpassed the 500-day mark. And next we go to Anarchy in the Arena, which will pit the Elite Kenny Omega, Hangman Page and the Young Bucks against Blackpool Combat Club's Jon Moxley, Bryan Danielson, Claudio Castagnoli and Wheeler Yuta. For this, I'm going to predict a little bit of a swerve that costs the Elite the win, setting up an even bigger rematch somewhere down the line. You may remember that it was Kenny Omega's former manager Don Callis that introduced the group to Konosuke Takeshita a few weeks ago, somebody that I think will now pledge his allegiance to the Blackpool Combat Club, helping them win the match with the numbers game. Of course, it was Don that cost Omega the cage match against Moxley, and now we can bring in Takeshita to do the same thing this time around. This then takes us one step closer to an eventual blood and guts match, which needs 6 men on each team, leaving 2 spots open for the Elite, and perhaps a debuting Kota Ibushi can take up one of them, whilst the Blackpool Combat Club will seek to fill one more spot on top of Takeshita, with this perhaps being the story that AEW tell in the weeks ahead. And speaking of title matches, next we have FTR defending their AEW World Tag Championships against Jeff Jarrett and Jay Lethal, who are both still looking for their first gold in AEW. For this one, Mark Briscoe, who has found himself caught in the middle of this feud, will be in the ring as the special guest referee. This past week on Dynamite, Briscoe would show frustration with both camps ahead of the pay-per-view, making it difficult to tell if he will help one side out or will call it down the middle. With that said, I can see Mark calling it down the middle for this one, preventing any nonsense happening from the heel team, leading to a fair and square FTR victory, healing their friendship with the special referee in the process. Next up, we see the AEW TNT title on the line as the champion Wardlow defends against the ever-controversial Christian Cage. Whilst Cage would be a great candidate to have a run with the belt going forward, were this to happen, it would be Wardlow's 3rd ever TNT title loss in around 18 months, with all 3 of his reigns taking place in the past couple of years. My gut tells me that this run has more legs in it going forward, with Luchasaurus seemingly a likely candidate to challenge Wardlow next, which would extend this feud beyond Sunday night. So I'll go with a Wardlow victory for this one, although I do think this one is close to call. Next, we have the BLACKJACK Battle Royal to decide who leaves Double or Nothing as the AEW International Champion. The field for the match includes the reigning champ Orange Cassidy, the Butcher and the Blade, Bandido, Commander, Lee Moriarty, Big Bill, Arya Daivari, Tony Nese, Chuck Taylor and Trent Beretta, Kip Sabian, Ray Phoenix, Dustin Rhodes, Keith Lee, Bullet Club Gold's Juice Robinson and Jay White, Ricky Starks, Brian Cage, Swerve Strickland and Penta El Cero Miedo. Given the number of participants, this is likely the hardest match to call on the card, although I'll go with what I want to see happen rather than what I think will happen. Personally, I'd love it if Switchblade Jay White left with the gold in this one, putting the gold in his faction name, elevating both him and the belt in the process, with this opening up a whole world of matchups for one of AEW's hottest names. Anyone outside of the world title picture should be in line for a shot at Switchblade in and outside of AEW. Next up is an easier one to predict if reports are to be believed, but we'll get into why just in a second. First, let's set the field as AEW Women's World Champion Jamie Hayter heads into Double or Nothing to take on Toni Storm, the wrestler she beat for the belt in the first place. Back then, the title was referred to as the Interim, this before AEW later made Storm's run official, before naming Hayter the champion of the division. Reports suggest that Hayter has been struggling with an injury as of late, which adds doubt to as if she'll be keeping the belt around her waist heading out of the pay-per-view, particularly with AEW's ever-expanding schedule needing a fighting champion on the card. Whilst this could be a work to set up a big win and swerve at the pay-per-view, for me I'll go with a Toni Storm win, which makes her a two-time AEW Women's World Champion and the head of the Outcasts. And now we got into the main event and what's likely the easiest decision to predict of the night. However, it's what might happen after the match that raises questions. AEW World Champion MJF will defend his title against fellow pillars of AEW, Darby Allin, Sammy Guevara and Jungle Boy Jack Perry. In the build-up to the match, it's hard to argue that Darby has been the standout amongst the challengers for not only his connection with the audience, but also his believable promos on the mic to hype the fight. However, with that said, it's clear to me at least that MJF will leave as still champion, and you'll find it difficult to find anybody that says otherwise. With such a predictable outcome to the match, this could mean one of two things. First, that AEW will position the match lower down the card, perhaps allowing the Anarchy in the Arena match to close the show, or second, they have a surprise plan for after the show. One name that springs to mind is the returning CM Punk, who was set to continue his rivalry with MJF heading out of All Out 2022, although as we know, his injury and other factors prevented this from happening. Leading up to that moment, the now champion was starting to ramp up talk of a bidding war of 2024 between AEW and WWE, something that is clearly a nod to both the WWE and ROH Summer of Punk. You may have noticed this past week on Dynamite that the bidding war was brought up once again by Max, with some feeling that this was planting the seeds for a confrontation between the best in the world and the man that's better than you, a mirror image from the close of the infamous All Out event. Whilst this isn't a prediction, I'd say it's certainly a possibility as AEW head towards the debut of Collision, although I'd personally save CM Punk's return for the United Center on June 17th. But let me know what your predictions are in the comments down below. And before you go, make sure you check out how AEW can change wrestling forever.